The rhythmic sound of the helicopter's blades filled the air, a mechanical melody, contrasting with the silence of the vast rainforest below. Dmitri, sitting with a serious expression, was reviewing documents on his tablet. The businessman seemed impervious to the wild beauty stretching out as far as the eye could see. Ekaterina, beside him, watched her husband with a mixture of frustration and resignation. She had tried to make conversation several times during the flight, but Dmitri's monosyllabic responses made her retreat. Mikhail, only 5 years old, was beside his mother, his eyes shining with curiosity. He tightly held onto a worn-out teddy bear, his inseparable companion. The child looked out the window, pointing at the green carpet below. "Mommy, are there people living down there?" he asked, pointing at the forest. Before Ekaterina could answer, Anatoly, the pilot, slightly turned his head without taking his eyes off the control panel. "Yes, kid. These forests are home to some indigenous communities that have lived here for centuries with little contact with the outside world." His voice was calm, almost didactic. "They know every tree, every animal. It's a world completely different from ours." Mikhail seemed fascinated, while Ekaterina cast a concerned look at Dmitri. He didn't even lift his eyes from the tablet. "Have you been there, Anatoly?" Ekaterina asked, trying to distract herself from the awkward silence. "A few times on expeditions. These people are mysterious and reserved, but very wise. They know how to survive in a place that would be uninhabitable for us." Anatoly smiled slightly. "But it's not the kind of place you'd want to get stuck in." The comment made Ekaterina furrow her brow, as if a shadow of unease passed over her. Mikhail, however, seemed more intrigued than scared. "Do they have children?" he asked, pressing his teddy bear against his chest. "Yes, they do," Anatoly replied in a softer tone. "And if you had the chance to meet them, I bet they would love your teddy bear." Mikhail smiled, but Ekaterina felt a pang in her chest. The thought that those children lived in conditions so different from Mikhail's made her reflect on how superficial her own life seemed lately. She looked at Dmitri again, wishing he would share something of his thoughts, but he remained oblivious. As the helicopter continued to fly through the sky, the conversation dwindled. Ekaterina tried to focus on the landscape, but couldn't shake the growing sense of isolation. The jungle below seemed so full of life, yet so unattainable. The tension between her and Dmitri, his emotional distance from the family, all seemed to intensify in that confined space. She gently stroked Mikhail's hair as he began to play with the teddy bear and sighed. What should have been a relaxing trip felt like an extension of her daily problems. She tried not to think about it, focusing on her son's innocent smile. But at that moment, Anatoly broke the silence again, his tone more serious this time. "You know, not everyone understands the power of nature until they're right in the middle of it. The jungle has its own rhythm, its own rules. And when you're up here, it's easy to forget just how vast it is. Down there, everything seems different." He paused, "and unpredictable." The comment sounded enigmatic and made Ekaterina glance at Dmitri. He finally lifted his eyes from the tablet, but only briefly glanced out the window before returning to his work. Mikhail resumed asking questions, but Ekaterina didn't hear them. Her mind was distant, pondering what Anatoly had said. She wondered what it would be like to live disconnected in a world where things like money, fame, or ambition meant nothing. The helicopter continued to fly over the forest, but something in the atmosphere felt heavy. Dmitri, indifferent, typed on his tablet. Ekaterina held Mikhail's hand, trying to ward off the discomfort growing in her chest. Deep down, a sense that something was about to change began to form. The helicopter continued its route over the vast green carpet of the forest, when a sharp, irregular sound cut through the constant hum of the blades. Anatoly, with an expression suddenly alert, adjusted the controls on the panel, his eyes quickly moving between the instruments. Ekaterina noticed the shift in his posture and instinctively squeezed Mikhail's hand. "Is everything okay?" she asked, trying to mask the nervousness in her voice. "Small technical issue. Nothing to worry about. For now." Anatoly tried to sound calm, but the sweat beginning to form on his forehead said otherwise. Dmitri, finally looking up from his tablet, raised his gaze to the pilot. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice firm but tense. "Some failure in the hydraulic systems. We're losing altitude, but I'll manage it." Anatoly adjusted the controls with quick, precise movements, though his expression grew more tense. The helicopter began to shake lightly, and the sound of the blades changed, becoming more irregular. Ekaterina held Mikhail tightly as he scared, pressed his teddy bear against his chest. "Mommy, what's happening?" he asked, his voice thin, on the verge of tears. "Everything's fine, sweetie. We just need to stay calm." Ekaterina tried to sound confident, but her eyes betrayed the growing panic. Dmitri, not knowing what to do, stared fixedly at Anatoly, hoping the pilot could fix the problem. But the helicopter was now shaking alarmingly, each jolt making Ekaterina grip the seat and Mikhail more tightly. "We need to land," and fast, Anatoly said, his voice sharp. "I'm looking for an open spot in the forest." The silence in the cabin was broken only by the increasing sound of the alarm on the control panel. Dmitri tried to grab Ekaterina's arm, but she was busy protecting their son. The helicopter plunged at dangerous angles as Anatoly made abrupt maneuvers to stabilize it. Finally, he spotted a small clearing in the forest, barely big enough for an emergency landing. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he informed everyone, "Hold on tight. This is going to be rough." Ekaterina hugged Mikhail tightly while Dmitri, gripping the seat, fought against the fear consuming him. The helicopter was descending rapidly, the trees getting closer and closer. A gust of wind threw them to the side, and Mikhail let out a scream of terror. His teddy bear slipped from his hands and fell to the floor of the cabin. "My teddy bear!" he shouted, trying to break free from Ekaterina to grab it. "No, stay with me." She held onto her son tightly, struggling to keep calm. The impact was brutal. The helicopter hit the ground with a deafening crash, the structure shaking violently. The blades stopped spinning with a sharp metallic sound, and everything went silent for a moment that felt eternal. Ekaterina opened her eyes, her heart racing. Mikhail was crying in her arms but appeared unharmed. Dmitri was pale, still gripping the seat so tightly that the knuckles of his fingers were white. Anatoly, though dazed, began checking the controls. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, turning to face the passengers. His tone was firm, but the relief in his voice was clear. "I think so," Ekaterina replied, her voice trembling. She looked at Dmitri, who silently nodded. Mikhail, sobbing between breaths, muttered, "My teddy bear." Ekaterina quickly picked the toy up from the floor and handed it to her son, who hugged it as if it were his anchor amidst the chaos. Outside, the forest surrounded them like a living giant, the sounds of animals echoing through the trees. The helicopter was partially tilted, with deep marks in the vegetation around it. Anatoly stepped out to inspect the damage, but his expression indicated that the situation was serious. Inside the cabin, Ekaterina closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Dmitri, beside her, seemed lost in thought. For the first time, he had no answers. The jungle around them, with its oppressive vastness, was a reminder that they were now completely at the mercy of nature. And the unsettling feeling that this was just the beginning began to form in their hearts. The jungle was alive. The sound of insects and birds echoed around them, mixing with the rustling of the trees swaying in the wind. Dmitri watched Anatoly inspect the helicopter damage with attention, while Ekaterina tried to calm Mikhail. The child was clinging to his teddy bear, still frightened by the violent landing. "How long until this is fixed?" Dmitri asked, his voice laden with impatience, but also a slight hesitation. Anatoly shook his head, his expression serious. "The hydraulic system is completely damaged. We won't get out of here without external help. I need time to try to make contact via radio, but with the forest coverage, it will be tricky." Before Ekaterina could ask anything, Mikhail pointed toward the dense vegetation surrounding the clearing. "Mommy, there's someone over there," he said, his voice low and filled with fear. Ekaterina turned immediately, her eyes scanning the shadows of the trees. For a moment, everything seemed normal, but then she saw a slight movement. Figures appeared silently between the leaves, their faces painted and bodies adorned with feathers and necklaces made of bones and seeds. Each one held a spear or a bow, their eyes fixed on the group. Dmitri took a step back, pulling Ekaterina behind him. "Anatoly, what is this?" he whispered, trying to control the panic in his voice. The pilot raised his hands, trying to appear as harmless as possible. "Don't make any sudden movements. Let me handle this." Anatoly advanced slowly, gesturing calmly as he spoke. "We're not a threat. We just need help." The indigenous people didn't respond. They remained still, silently surrounding the helicopter. The leader of the group, a tall and imposing man, stepped forward. He carried a spear decorated with glowing stones and had a piercing gaze that seemed to assess every detail of the group. Ekaterina kept Mikhail close to her, trying to shield him with her own body. The boy was petrified, his wide eyes locked on the strangers. The indigenous leader spoke something in a language none of them understood. His voice was firm, but not aggressive. Anatoly tried to communicate with gestures, pointing at the helicopter and then at the group, repeating simple phrases. "We're lost. We need help. We don't want to hurt anyone." The man studied Anatoly for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he considered the pilot's words. Finally, he signaled to the group. The others lowered their weapons slightly, but didn't drop them. "I think they want us to follow them," Anatoly whispered, gesturing for Dmitri and Ekaterina. "It's better we cooperate." "Follow them? Where to?" Dmitri protested, his voice harsh. "What if it's a trap?" Ekaterina looked at Dmitri firmly. "Do we have a choice? They don't seem hostile, but we could make things worse if we resist." Dmitri sighed, reluctant, but nodded. Anatoly stepped forward, signaling that he was willing to follow the group. The indigenous leader nodded in response and gestured for the others to start walking. The group moved in a line, with the indigenous people forming a circle around them, ensuring that no one strayed too far. Ekaterina held Mikhail's hand, who looked back from time to time, as if expecting the helicopter to disappear into the distance. The walk through the forest was slow and tense. The dense vegetation seemed to envelop them, the sounds of nature now seeming more threatening than before. Dmitri stumbled a few times, muttering low curses, while Anatoly kept a neutral expression, trying to mentally track the path. After a while, the vegetation began to open up, revealing a village surrounded by towering trees. Grass huts and wooden structures formed a small cluster, and several people began to emerge, curiously eyeing the newcomers. There were children, women, and elders, all with curious but cautious expressions. The indigenous leader stopped at the center of the village, turning to face the group. He said something to the others, who began to disperse, but the leader's attention remained fixed on them. Ekaterina noticed that despite the initial fear, the villagers' gazes were not hostile, only wary. Mikhail pressed closer to his mother, whispering, "Are they going to hurt us?" Ekaterina knelt down, gently holding her son's face. "No, sweetie. They're trying to understand us, just like we're trying to understand them." The indigenous leader gestured for them to wait there, and some villagers began to approach, observing them with growing curiosity. Ekaterina looked at Dmitri, who seemed uncomfortable, but finally murmured, "I hope you're right about this." At that moment, the village felt like an enigma, full of questions waiting for answers. The village was alive with sounds and movements, but there was something serene in the way its inhabitants moved. Ekaterina held Mikhail firmly as he clutched his teddy bear against his chest, watching everything with wide eyes. Dmitri, always so confident in familiar environments, seemed out of place, his eyes restlessly scanning the thatched huts and the curious faces watching them. The indigenous leader, imposing in his stance, gestured for the group to wait near a large central fire. He exchanged a few quick words with other villagers before disappearing into one of the larger huts. Anatoly leaned toward Ekaterina and Dmitri, speaking softly. "They don't seem hostile. They just want to understand who we are and what we're doing here. Stay calm." Ekaterina nodded, trying to appear calm, though she didn't feel it. Mikhail's attention was caught by a group of children who were watching him from a distance. One of them pointed at the teddy bear, curious, and Mikhail clutched the toy even tighter against his chest, as if afraid of losing it. A short time later, the leader returned, accompanied by a woman whose face was marked with worry. She carried a small child in her arms, a girl who seemed no older than 4 or 5 years. Her body was limp, her skin pale like wax. Her eyes were half closed, showing signs of a high fever, and her breathing was irregular. Ekaterina felt a tightness in her chest as she looked at the girl. It was impossible not to think of Mikhail, so full of life by her side. She stepped forward instinctively, but was stopped by the leader's gaze. He made a gesture to the woman, who gently placed the child on a mat near the fire. "What's wrong with her?" Ekaterina asked, her voice laden with concern, though she knew she wouldn't be understood. Anatoly tried to mediate communication, pointing to the girl and asking simple questions in a curious tone. The mother responded in her language, her voice trembling as she pointed to the child, to the sky, and then to the ground, as if trying to explain what had happened. It was clear they had already tried everything within their reach. "She's been sick for a long time," murmured Anatoly, trying to interpret the gestures. "It seems none of their traditional medicines are working." Ekaterina knelt beside the girl, ignoring the visible reluctance of the mother. She gently touched the child's forehead, feeling the heat of the intense fever. The girl barely reacted to the touch. "Dmitri, we have to do something," she said urgently. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Dmitri responded, his eyes narrowing. "We're stuck in the middle of the jungle with no resources. This isn't our responsibility. She's going to die if we do nothing." Ekaterina snapped, feeling frustration and anger rise to the surface. Mikhail, who was standing nearby, watched everything with wide, silent eyes. He looked at the girl, then at his mother, and whispered, "Mommy, she's really sick." Ekaterina stroked her son's face, forcing a reassuring smile, but her mind was racing. She turned to Anatoly. "Can we get help? Someone, anything? We need to get her out of here." Anatoly hesitated, but finally nodded. "I'll try to make contact with the radio again. I'm not sure if it'll work, but we have to try." As Anatoly walked away, Ekaterina turned her attention to the girl's mother, trying to convey empathy through gestures and looks. She pointed to the sky and then to the girl, trying to communicate the idea of taking her to a hospital. The mother looked at the leader, who watched everything in silence. There was a long moment of tension as the leader pondered. Finally, he nodded slowly, but his gaze seemed full of expectation. To Ekaterina, it was clear that they were trusting her as their last resort. Anatoly returned quickly, a slight smile of relief on his face. "I got a signal. A rescue helicopter is on the way, but it will take a few hours." Ekaterina sighed, feeling a mixture of relief and concern. She looked again at the girl, so fragile and vulnerable, and gently squeezed her mother's hand, as if silently promising to do everything within her power to save her life. As the village resumed its routine around them, Ekaterina felt that something had changed. The connection with this mother and her daughter was deeper than anything she could explain. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a burning purpose growing within her. The distant sound of the rescue helicopter finally broke the oppressive silence of the forest. Ekaterina looked up at the sky with a mix of relief and anxiety, holding the hand of the girl's mother, who was sitting beside her sick daughter. The woman's face, marked by fatigue, lit up with a spark of hope. Dmitri was a few steps away, observing the movement with his arms crossed and a worried expression. Despite his initial reluctance, something in him seemed to have changed. The gravity of the situation affected him more than he wanted to admit. Mikhail, in turn, continued to cling to his teddy bear, observing everything with wide, attentive eyes. The helicopter landed in the clearing with difficulty, its blades kicking up a cloud of dust and leaves. Two paramedics quickly descended, bringing a stretcher and basic medical equipment. Anatoly met them halfway, explaining the situation in rapid, precise words. "We have a very sick child. We need to get her to the nearest hospital immediately," he said. The paramedics nodded and followed Anatoly to where the girl was. One of them knelt beside her, checking her vital signs, while the other prepared the stretcher. Ekaterina approached, watching carefully as they worked. The girl was pale and motionless, her breathing weak but present. "She's very unstable," one of the paramedics said, looking at Ekaterina. "We'll need to monitor her closely during the flight." The girl's mother began murmuring words in her language, clearly anxious. Ekaterina held her hands firmly, looking into her eyes. "We'll take care of her. I promise," she said, hoping her voice and gesture would be enough to convey confidence. As the girl was placed on the stretcher, Mikhail took a hesitant step forward. "Mommy, can she take my teddy bear?" he asked, his voice soft but full of determination. Ekaterina looked at him, surprised and moved. She knelt beside her son, stroking his face. "Are you sure, sweetie? It's very important to you." Mikhail nodded, holding the toy with both hands before gently placing it next to the girl. "Maybe it will help her get better," he said, with a small, shy smile. Ekaterina felt a wave of pride and emotion, but before she could say anything, the paramedics signaled that they were ready for takeoff. Ekaterina, the girl's mother, and Anatoly boarded the helicopter, leaving Dmitri and Mikhail in the clearing with the villagers. Dmitri stood still, watching the helicopter slowly rise and disappear into the horizon, his thoughts sinking into silence. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere was tense. The girl began to have slight spasms, and the paramedics worked quickly to stabilize her. Ekaterina held the mother's hand, who was crying softly, her strength beginning to crumble. "She'll be fine. We need to believe," Ekaterina whispered, trying to comfort the woman while also convincing herself. Suddenly, one of the paramedics shouted, "She's going into cardiac arrest. Prepare the defibrillator." Ekaterina's heart raced as the equipment was quickly prepared. She could barely breathe as she watched the paramedics deliver the electric shocks. The girl's small body arched with each jolt, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. The child's mother squeezed her eyes shut, tears silently streaming down her face. After 3 attempts, the heart monitor finally showed signs of a rhythm. The paramedics sighed in relief, but they knew the battle was far from over. We've managed to stabilize her, but her condition is still critical. We need to get to the hospital as fast as possible, one of them informed. Ekaterina exhaled slowly, feeling a wave of relief, but also emotional exhaustion. She looked at the girl's mother, who continued murmuring prayers, holding her daughter's arm as if her life depended on it. The helicopter landed at the nearest hospital, where a medical team was already waiting. The girl was quickly transferred to a stretcher and taken into the building. Ekaterina and the girl's mother followed closely behind, but were stopped in a waiting room while the doctors began emergency procedures. Sitting in a hard chair, Ekaterina felt the weight of the journey up to that point. She looked at the girl's mother, who seemed lost in her thoughts, and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "She's in good hands now," Ekaterina said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed her own words. The hours that followed were long and silent. Ekaterina didn't leave the woman's side, who finally fell asleep from exhaustion. When a doctor appeared in the doorway with a neutral expression, Ekaterina felt her heart stop for a moment. "She's stable, but she still needs intensive care. The next few days will be critical," the doctor said. Ekaterina translated the information as best she could to the girl's mother, who sighed deeply before covering her face with her hands, torn between tears of relief and concern. Ekaterina felt that, although this moment was far from a happy ending, it was an important step toward something greater. The hospital was a stark contrast to the village. The cold lights, the sounds of machines monitoring heartbeats, and the constant movement of professionals created an environment of tension and hope. Ekaterina sat next to the girl's mother, while Mikhail silently played with a piece of paper and a pencil that one of the nurses had given him. Dmitri, standing by the window, gazed out at the world beyond, lost in thought. The girl was in a separate room, connected to various machines monitoring her recovery. The doctors had explained that she needed complete rest, but the signs were positive. Mikhail's teddy bear, placed beside her, seemed like a small comforting detail in the clinical setting. "You knew she would do this, didn't you?" Dmitri broke the silence, his voice low but filled with emotion. He looked at Ekaterina, though not directly. "Risk everything, take the girl, put all of us in this situation. You just knew you couldn't ignore it." Ekaterina sighed, exhausted but determined. "It wasn't a choice, Dmitri. It was what needed to be done. I can't turn my back on something like this. Not with her, so close to." Her voice faltered, but she composed herself. "Not with Mikhail watching. He needed to see that we can make a difference." Dmitri shifted his gaze to their son, who was drawing something on the paper. It was a helicopter surrounded by trees, with human figures around it. Dmitri couldn't help but smile slightly. "He's stronger than I thought." Dmitri sat down beside Ekaterina, something he hadn't done in a long time. "And you too. I don't know how you do it." Ekaterina looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his words. "Maybe I just stopped trying to fix what doesn't matter and focused on what truly matters." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Dmitri, we can't keep going like this. We can't live apart while pretending to be a family." He fell silent for a moment, breathing heavily as he processed her words. Finally, he nodded. "I know. Maybe this is my chance to change." He looked at her, his eyes finally showing sincerity. "For us. For him." Before Ekaterina could respond, Mikhail approached holding his drawing. "Mom, Dad, look what I did. It's the helicopter when it brought us here." He pointed at the teddy bear in the drawing, next to a figure that clearly represented the girl. "I think she's going to get better, right?" Ekaterina smiled, caressing her son's face. "I think so, sweetie. She has so many people taking care of her now." Dmitri took Mikhail's drawing and studied it for a moment before speaking. "That's a really good drawing, son. I think she's going to like seeing this when she wakes up." Time at the hospital seemed to drag, but it also offered moments of reconnection. Dmitri began to spend more time with Mikhail, playing with him during breaks between visits to the girl's room. Ekaterina noticed small gestures of affection that she hadn't seen in years. Dmitri helping Mikhail draw, holding his hand while crossing the corridor, even smiling more often. When the girl finally woke up, the relief was palpable. The doctors informed them that her condition had improved significantly, and she was no longer in immediate danger. The girl's mother couldn't hold back her tears of happiness, holding her daughter's hand as if she would never let go. Ekaterina and Mikhail were the first to visit her. Mikhail was nervous, holding the drawing with both hands. "Can I give this to her, Mommy?" he asked. Ekaterina smiled, guiding him to the bed. The girl was weak, but her eyes brightened when she saw the drawing. Mikhail placed it on the table next to the bed, pointing at the teddy bear in the drawing. "This is my teddy bear. He's taking care of you, okay?" he said, his voice sweet and full of empathy. The girl's mother looked at Ekaterina with gratitude, even though they didn't share a common language. It was a moment of connection that transcended words. Later, Dmitri entered the room, and to Ekaterina's surprise, he addressed the girl's mother with a respectful gesture. "You're very strong. Your daughter, too." He looked at Ekaterina as if silently thanking her for bringing him here. As they left the hospital that night, the sky was clear, filled with stars. Mikhail held his parents' hands, and Ekaterina felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Dmitri squeezed her hand a little tighter, a simple gesture, but one that marked the beginning of something new. The experience had transformed all of them in different ways, but there was one certainty: together, they were stronger. The helicopter flew over the skies of the dense forest, the rhythmic sound of the blades filling the silence between Ekaterina, Dmitri, and Mikhail. Beside them, the mother and the recently recovered girl seemed eager to return to the village. The girl looked noticeably stronger, her eyes shining with curiosity as she gazed out the window. She held Mikhail's drawing in one hand and her teddy bear firmly in the other. Ekaterina glanced at Dmitri from time to time. He seemed calmer, less tense than in the previous weeks. His transformation was subtle, but undeniable. The man who once appeared detached from the world around him now looked outside, admiring the vastness of the forest with an almost contemplative expression. "Do you think they'll welcome us well?" Dmitri asked, breaking the silence. "I think so," replied Ekaterina. "We've brought something very important back for them." Mikhail, excited, turned to his mother. "Do you think the kids will want to play with me this time?" Ekaterina smiled and ruffled her son's hair. "I'm sure they will, dear." The helicopter began to descend, and the clearing of the village came into view. As they landed, the group of indigenous people had already gathered, waiting. There was a mix of anticipation and tension in the air. The village leader was at the forefront, his serious expression watching as the helicopter touched the ground. As soon as the door opened, the mother stepped out with the girl, and a stir swept through the village. People approached, speaking rapidly in their language as they touched the girl carefully, as if needing to confirm she was truly there. The leader watched in silence, but his eyes gleamed with quiet relief. Ekaterina, Dmitri, and Mikhail followed shortly after. Mikhail held his mother's arm, a little intimidated by the attention, but curious. Anatoly, who had flown the helicopter, stayed nearby, watching the scene with a smile. The village leader approached Ekaterina, looking at her seriously. For a moment, she didn't know what to expect, but then he extended a hand. In his palm was a small amulet made of carved stone, tied with a natural fiber cord. "He's thanking you," Anatoly said, translating the gesture. "This amulet is a symbol of protection and gratitude. It's something very important to them." Ekaterina took the amulet with reverence, feeling the symbolic weight of the gesture. The leader spoke briefly in his language, and Anatoly translated. "He says that now you are part of the village's history, that your kindness will be remembered by them and future generations." Mikhail tugged on Ekaterina's arm, looking at the leader. "Mom, does he know the teddy bear helped too?" Ekaterina laughed and translated to Anatoly, who explained the story to the leader. He looked at Mikhail, a small smile appearing on his serious face, and made a gesture of thanks, bowing his head slightly. The girl's mother approached Ekaterina, gripping her hands tightly. There were no words, but the emotional gaze said everything. The girl, still holding the teddy bear, stepped toward Mikhail and gave him an unexpected hug. He stood still for a moment, surprised, before smiling and hugging her back. The village, once marked by distrust, was now filled with a sense of celebration. People brought fruits and natural drinks to share with the visitors. Children began to play around Mikhail, who finally let go and ran after them, laughing. Dmitri watched everything with a different look. He walked over to Ekaterina and said, "I think we had a lot to learn from them. And maybe from each other too." Ekaterina looked at him, surprised but happy. It was the first time in years he had said something so openly. "I think this trip was just the beginning," she replied, smiling. As the sun began to set, the village was full of life. Dmitri and Ekaterina sat on a log, watching Mikhail play with the indigenous children. Ekaterina held the amulet in her hands, feeling a mix of gratitude and peace. The leader, noticing the evening approaching, came closer once again and said something to Anatoly, who translated. "He wants you to know that you will always be welcome here. This will be your second home, if you wish." Ekaterina nodded, feeling the weight of the words. There was something deep and transformative in that moment, something that would stay with them forever. When the helicopter took off later, leaving the village behind, Ekaterina felt a new kind of connection to life. Dmitri held her hand, and Mikhail, exhausted, slept leaning against her lap. The forest, with all its mystery, now seemed like a symbol of rebirth and transformation. The city felt different when they returned. Dmitri looked out the car window as the urban landscape unfolded before them. Tall buildings, busy streets, and bright billboards starkly contrasted with the simplicity of the village they had left behind. But something inside him had changed. The life that once seemed filled with goals and business now sounded empty, compared to the depth of the experiences they had lived. Ekaterina sat beside him, the stone amulet hanging from her neck. She held it occasionally, almost unconsciously, as if it were a physical reminder of the journey they had crossed. Mikhail, in the backseat, held a new teddy bear that Dmitri had bought for him, although the boy still talked about the special teddy bear that had stayed with the girl in the village. "Mom, do you think they're okay?" Mikhail asked, his voice breaking the silence. Ekaterina smiled at him through the rearview mirror. "I'm sure they're fine, sweetie. They have the strength of the village with them. And your teddy bear is there too, taking care of her." Mikhail smiled, satisfied with the answer. Dmitri looked at his son, a silent tenderness filling his face. When they got home, the luxurious space seemed more vast and less cozy than Ekaterina remembered. The modern furniture, the spotless walls, everything felt cold in a way she hadn't noticed before. She felt a tightness in her chest, but also a renewed sense of determination. "How about we have dinner together tonight?" Dmitri suddenly asked, as he placed the bags on the floor. Ekaterina looked up at him, surprised. Dmitri rarely suggested spending time together unless she insisted. "Sure, I'll make something simple," she smiled, feeling a spark of hope. That night was the first in years that they had dinner without rushing, talking about little but meaningful things. Dmitri told Mikhail stories about business trips he had never mentioned before. Ekaterina shared how she felt seeing the girl fight for life, and Mikhail, between bites of his food, described how the children in the village ran faster than he did. "Maybe I should run more to catch up with them when we go back," Mikhail said, laughing. Dmitri looked at Ekaterina, and for the first time in a long time, she saw sincerity in his eyes. "We will go back. We owe it to them," he said firmly. The days that followed were different. Dmitri began spending less time on the phone and more time with Mikhail, helping him with simple tasks or just playing. He seemed more present, more attentive. Ekaterina, for her part, started thinking about ways to help communities like the village they had visited. The idea of using resources to support those who had so little began to grow inside her. One afternoon, while they were walking in a nearby park, Mikhail suddenly asked, "Mom, do you think the girl remembers the drawing I gave her?" Ekaterina knelt down to be at her son's level, holding his shoulders. "I'm sure she'll never forget, sweetie." Sometimes small gestures can change an entire life. Mikhail smiled, satisfied, and ran off to play. Dmitri, standing beside her, watched with a thoughtful expression. "He's right, you know," Dmitri said, looking at Ekaterina. "Small gestures. I think I've spent too much time forgetting that." Ekaterina took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "The important thing is that we're remembering now." Together, the wind blew gently, rustling the leaves around them. The weight of responsibilities felt lighter, while what truly mattered became clear. The experience with the village had not only brought them together as a family, but also taught them to appreciate human connections, simplicity, and the power of small acts of kindness. Dmitri, who had once seemed cold and distant, now made an effort to be more present. Ekaterina, who had always felt isolated, found purpose in the idea of helping those who needed it most. And Mikhail, with his childlike purity, continued to be the link that connected them. As they walked together through the park, the stone amulet hanging around Ekaterina's neck seemed to shine in the sunlight. It was a symbol of protection, but also of transformation, a constant reminder that the deepest changes often come from the places we least expect. This story shows us how small gestures can transform lives and how unexpected moments can reconnect us with what truly matters. If you also believe in the power of human connections and helping others, please like this video so more people can be touched by this message. Subscribe to the channel to follow more inspiring stories like this, and tell me in the comments which moment of this journey touched you the most. I'd love to hear your thoughts.